Hi, Mr. Poitras. So today I'm going to be speaking about my study, which was about adolescent perceptions surrounding the role and importance of political party loyalty. So to begin my presentation today, I'm going to be quickly speaking about the guiding research questions that I centered my project around. Before getting into my presentation, I do just want to quickly mention that because of the sheer size and scope of my study, which included both a survey and an interview / mock election component, it is physically impossible for me to keep this within 10 minutes. So I do apologize in advance if this ends up going significantly over the anticipated time limit. Unfortunately, because, as I say, of this sheer size and scope of my study, I'm not going to be able to mention all of the requirements that I've completed for this assignment. For example, I'm not going to have time to read through my abstract. I'm not going to have time to speak about the relevance of my topic or how I went about choosing it, and I'm likely not going to have time to speak in depth about the limitations of my research in the discussion component of my TED Talk at the end of the video. However, I have taken the time to type out very detailed and very thoughtful responses to each of the rubric criteria and instructions and each of the guiding questions that were listed in the Canvas on the instructions page. And so I'm hoping that after I submit those on Canvas, you'll be able to quickly go in and read them and take a look at them before grading my TED Talk. So case in point, I apologize if this is significantly over the time limit, but because of the scope of my assignment, it's just not possible for me to keep it within 10 minutes. So on to the guiding research questions that I centered my project around. I had two that I primarily focused on. The first one was, to what extent do adolescent voters prize political party loyalty over the preservation of democratic principles? And the second was, to what extent would adolescent voters be willing to sacrifice their partisan or policy interests in order to defend the country's democratic principles? So in addition to my primary guiding questions, I also wanted to answer a couple of the following supplemental questions, namely, are adolescents more likely to support political parties or individual politicians? Does political polarization prevent adolescents from supporting the parties that they most directly align with, agree with, or support? And do adolescents hold their political parties or preferred political candidates accountable for fulfilling their campaign promises or staying true to their initial party platforms? In addition, some of the other supplemental questions that I wanted to answer and learn about throughout my research were, how likely are adolescents to cut off friendships or familial relationships due to differing political beliefs? And last but not least, has growing societal pressure to be politically correct impacted the political views of adolescents today? So in terms of the methodology of my assignment, in order to answer the previously stated questions, I designed a 30-question survey and conducted 15 45-minute-long interviews with students from each grade band at Appleby. In order to learn about the political perceptions of students in middle school, upper school, and senior school, the survey, which took approximately 15 minutes to complete, was emailed to each of the grade band directors, so Mr. Patrick for middle school, Mr. Patterson for upper school, and Mr. Morris for senior school, who then forwarded the survey to students in their corresponding grade bands. And I did this because the word adolescent itself obviously ranges in ages and refers to young teenagers like middle schoolers and maybe older teenagers like senior schoolers like myself. And so I was curious to sort of broaden the scope of my assignment by looking at perceptions of middle schoolers, upper schoolers, and senior schoolers. And for that reason, I worked with the department heads and the grade band directors in order to send out my survey to the entire student body. So in terms of the survey itself, it was comprised of 10 multiple choice questions, 15 slider questions, 2 ranking style questions, and 3 free response / short answer questions. The questions themselves were divided into 3 subsections, which were each designed to learn more about the political perceptions of students at Appleby College. And so the first section was the quickest and took the least amount of time to complete, and it was specifically designed to collect some general information about the personal and political identities of the survey respondents. The second section was comprised of 15 hypothetical situation-based questions, which were designed to be answered as quickly, accurately, and honestly as possible. And as a result, students were asked to complete them in as little time as possible, to just read through them once and to give their initial responses to each of the questions. In order to receive the most opinionated result as possible, I deliberately made sure that there was no option to select neutral or undecided on any of the questions, as students tend to use that as the default to questions that they just haven't put much thought into. And so if students were unclear on what a question was asking or didn't have a clearly defined view on a certain question or topic, they were simply instructed to select the response that best reflected their political beliefs at the time. Last but not least, the final section was designed to gather more specific information, I would say, about the role and influence of media, of news channels and social media outlets, family members, friends, classmates, peers, teachers, and political stereotypes in the forging of adolescents' political values. So despite sending out my survey to the entire student body, unfortunately, only 50 students took the time to complete it. I'm assuming this was because of the duration and length of my survey, whereas some of my peers sent out 5 or 6 question surveys, which took 3 minutes to complete. Mine was significantly longer and did take 15 minutes to complete, and also because of the more complex topic and the more complex questions that my survey asked. I'm assuming that was a factor that discouraged a lot of students, especially younger students or maybe politically uneducated students, and deterred them from completing my survey. So the last question asked if any students would be interested in completing an additional 45-minute long interview. And while my initial plan was to interview 2 students from each grade band, I ended up interviewing 5 students from each grade band, which totaled 15 45-minute long interviews. So the interview itself was comprised of 5 open-ended questions, which were designed to gather more specific information about students' perceptions surrounding political party loyalty. And upon answering each of these open-ended short answer questions, the students were prompted to participate in a mock federal election. And so the purpose of this mock election was to determine whether or not adolescent voters, specifically adolescents at Appleby, would be willing to sacrifice their partisan or policy interests in order to defend the country's democratic principles. And I'll touch on this more in the Word document that I'll send with the specific, more detailed responses to the Canvas questions. But this was actually inspired by a research project that I read about when doing some research for my assignment, which was spearheaded by a professor named Dr. Matthew Graham at Yale University, who completed a study to determine whether or not American citizens would be willing to sacrifice their partisan or policy interests in order to defend the US's democratic principles. And so I found it to be a fascinating concept and wanted to do a similar type study for my project. So in order to test my guiding questions, the mock election was comprised of 2 separate ballots. The first was comprised of 6 anonymous political candidates, each of whom represented a different Canadian political party. And in an attempt to make the election as impartial and unbiased as possible, the candidates were all made up. None of them were real candidates, and their personal attributes were concealed and kept hidden from the student voters. So for example, their races, ethnicities, ages, economic backgrounds, education levels, and gender identities, to name a few, were hidden from the student voters at all times. Of course, while the names of the political candidates were kept a secret from the voters, partially because they were made-up candidates, the party that they represented was revealed to the student voters. And in an attempt to determine whether or not adolescents would remain loyal to their political parties in cases where they no longer agreed with their party's political platform, each candidate was accompanied by a 250 to 300 word write-up, which briefly explained their personal beliefs, political goals, and campaign promises. And I got aspects of these campaign promises from the actual websites from the Green Party, the Liberal Party, the NDP, the PPC, and the Bloc Québécois. While their platforms clearly reflected the beliefs of a certain political party, the names of the party that each candidate represented was ultimately swapped with the party of an opposing political candidate. And this was ultimately done for a couple reasons, but specifically the names of the parties that each candidate was incorrectly assigned. Okay, how do I explain this? Basically, in an attempt to make it apparent that each of the candidates had abandoned their initial party platform, the names of the parties that each candidate was incorrectly assigned were drastically different from the initial parties that they were designed to represent. So for example, candidate number 1, whose write-up clearly emulated the beliefs of the Conservatives was intentionally mislabeled as a left-wing candidate. In the slide I wrote like the Liberal Party representative, while candidate number 2, whose write-up clearly emulated the beliefs of the NDP, was intentionally mislabeled as the candidate for the PPC. And this way there was absolutely no confusion because, for example, if a candidate was designed to reflect the beliefs of the Green Party, that could easily be presumed to be the platforms of the Liberals or the NDP. And so I did it. I basically swapped every candidate's true party with another candidate from the other side of the political spectrum in order to ensure that that the names of the parties that each candidate was given were as different as possible from their original initial parties. So the purpose of this first ballot was to determine whether or not the adolescent voters would remain loyal to their political parties instead of voting for the individual candidate that they most closely aligned with. And the clearly incorrect ballot was designed to see if adolescent voters would even read each of the candidates' write-ups, or if they would immediately vote for the candidate that claimed to be the leader of their party, despite the fact that the true representative of their party was deliberately mislabeled as the representative of an opposing party. For example, if a stark supporter of the NDP voted for the undercover Bloc Québécois candidate who was incorrectly labeled as the NDP rep, I would infer that the student didn't take the time to read through the candidate's write-up and merely voted for the candidate because they claimed to represent that student's party. On the contrary, if a stark supporter of the Conservatives voted for a politician that was labeled as the representative of an opposing party, for example, the Liberals or the NDP, it would indicate to me that the student did, in fact, take the time to read through each candidate's write-up and would be willing to abandon their initial party if they no longer agreed with the party's platform. So the second ballot was comprised of 4 new political candidates, each of whom represented a different Canadian political party. Much like the first ballot, the candidates were all made up and their personal attributes were concealed in order to make it as impartial and unbiased as possible. Just like before, each candidate was accompanied by a 250 to 300 word write-up, which explained their political goals and campaign promises. The difference between the first ballot was that the correct names of their political parties were correct and were revealed to adolescent voters, so they were no longer swapped with opposing candidates. In an attempt to determine whether or not adolescents would be willing to punish the undemocratic behavior of their preferred political parties by voting for an opposing candidate or party, 3 of the 4 candidates were accused of committing overtly undemocratic actions. So, for example, the Conservative candidate was accused of gerrymandering and rigging the election. The NDP candidate was accused of being ineffective in office and was accused of abandoning the party's initial party platform. And the Liberal candidate was accused of wearing blackface at a party when he was in university. Sounds familiar. The final candidate was the representative of the People's Party, which is obviously a highly controversial and relatively unpopular party in Canada, which none of the survey participants claimed to support. And as a result, the PPC candidate was designed to be the only candidate who wasn't accused of committing an undemocratic action. In fact, the PPC leader was praised for being one of Canada's most reliable, dependable, trustworthy, forward-thinking, action-oriented, and change-achieving politicians. So the purpose of the second ballot was to see if the adolescent voters would sacrifice their partisan or policy interests in order to defend the country's democratic principles. For example, if a Conservative student voted for the Conservative candidate, I would infer that the student prizes party loyalty over the preservation of the country's democratic principles. However, if a student who supported the NDP, for example, voted for the PPC candidate, it would indicate to me that the student decided to punish the undemocratic actions of the NDP's leader by supporting the representative of the highly contentious PPC. So on to a brief analysis of my survey results. So the following set of slides are referring to the first section of my survey. So as you can see on the screen, this graph represents the gender distribution of the students that took the time to complete the survey. And I was incredibly surprised and excited to see that there was an equal distribution of male and female students who took the time to complete it. As you may or may not remember from my December assignment, in which I analyzed the reasons behind the lack of female interest and female engagement and female participation within politics at Appleby and in the broader Oakville community, I did discover in that assignment that there was a deficit of female interest in politics. And as a result, I did assume, or incorrectly assume, I should say, that there would be less females who took the time to complete my survey. However, I was incredibly pleased and excited to see that 23 male students and 23 female students took the time to complete my survey, demonstrating that both males and females are interested in learning more about Canada's political landscape. In terms of the political education levels of the survey participants, I was also very, very excited to see that the stark majority of the student body claimed to be either highly educated or somewhat educated in political topics, and only 15 students claimed that they were somewhat uneducated, and those 15 students, unironically, were all from middle school. It was also incredibly exciting to see that no students from any grade band indicated that they were very uneducated, which is exciting because Appleby is doing their job and students are clearly taking an interest in learning more about politics. In terms of student stances on the political spectrum, as you'll see in the pie graph listed above, it was almost 50-50 in terms of students who were aware of their stances on the political spectrum and students who were not, which was kind of surprising considering so many students indicated that they were highly educated about political matters. So it was a little disappointing to see the number of students who are unaware of their stances on the political spectrum. With that being said, I did analyze the stances of students that were aware about where their opinions are on the spectrum. So as you'll see in the chart listed, the most common stances among Appleby students are right-wing libertarians and left-wing libertarians, followed by centrists, and then only 4 students claim to be right-wing authoritarians, and then very bottom was left-wing authoritarians, with only 2 respondents identifying as left-wing authoritarians. So to summarize, in terms of economic stances, Appleby has slightly more right-wing students than left-wing students, and in terms of our social stances, our student body is comprised of more libertarians than authoritarians. So in terms of the political party affiliations of survey respondents, you'll see that once again there is a large amount of students who are not yet affiliated with a party, and what was disappointing was that of the students that claimed to be unaffiliated, it wasn't because they were unsure, but instead, in almost every single case, it was because they were just uninterested in learning and researching political parties in general. So that was disappointing to see. However, out of the students that did claim to be affiliated with a political party, the most widely supported and widely followed party at Appleby is the Conservative Party, followed by the Liberal Party and NDP, both of which 6 students claim to support, and then last but not least, unfortunately, unsurprisingly, the Green Party, which only 2 students support. So an interesting trend that I noticed within the political party affiliations of students was within the gender distribution of party affiliates. For example, 14 of the 17 students that claim to be Conservative Party members identified as cisgender males, whereas 12 female students identified as liberals, left-wing students, and only 2 male students professed to be left-wing. And so this demonstrates that male students at Appleby tend to identify as members of the right, whereas female students tend to identify as members of the left. Another trend can be seen within the political education levels of party affiliates. Interestingly enough, the majority of students who felt highly educated about political topics identified as right-wing or conservative, and the majority of students who claim to be slightly less educated or less dead set in their political views profess to be left-wing or liberal students. And so to summarize, students who are more well-versed in politics identify as conservative, and students who are still learning about politics identify as left-wing. So Some notable patterns, observations, and data trends from part 1 of the survey. According to the survey results, there are slightly more right-wing students than left-wing students at Appleby. According to the survey, more than 70% of our student body identifies as libertarians. As well, almost 40% of Appleby students are not yet affiliated with a specific political party, which unfortunately is largely because they are uninterested in learning about political parties. And last but not least, according to the survey results, the Conservative Party is the most widely supported and widely followed political party on the Appleby campus. In addition, male students tend to support right-wing political parties, while females tend to support left-wing. Highly educated students, highly educated students within the realm of politics tend to support right-wing political parties, specifically the Conservative Party, whereas left-wing students tend to be students who are still learning about politics and are less knowledgeable, or at least less dead set in their political ideologies. And finally, undecided youth voters tend to identify as left-wing. So on to part 2 of the survey. Approximately 60% of the survey participants indicated that they care more about the social beliefs of political parties than they do about the economic beliefs of political parties. And on the same hand, 75% of respondents claim to know more about the social beliefs than the economic beliefs of political parties. And these findings suggest that adolescent voters are generally more concerned about the social aspect of politics than they are about the economic aspect of politics. In addition, more than 70% of the survey respondents believe that the public should vote for political parties instead of individual politicians in federal elections, which is to say that the majority of Appleby students prefer the Canadian electoral process over the US's electoral process. On to the statement-based and hypothetical questions. The first statement read, if a politician that I admired was elected as the leader of an opposing political party, I would abandon my initial party and would give that politician my vote. So 38% of student participants selected somewhat disagree, while 32% selected strongly disagree to the above statement, while less than 25% of the student respondents selected somewhat agree. And finally, just over 5% selected that they strongly agreed with the statement. Based on these results, approximately 70% of the survey takers value political parties over individual politicians, which, as we know, is consistent with the previous finding that more than 70% of survey takers support voting for political parties instead of individual politicians in federal elections. The next statement read, if a politician that I didn't support was elected as the leader of my political party, I would remain loyal to my party and would give that politician my vote. To the above statement, approximately 62% indicated that they agreed, while the remaining 38% indicated that they disagreed. Based on these results, approximately 62% of the students who participated in the survey indicated that they value political parties over individual politicians, which once again is consistent with the previous finding that 70% of survey takers would remain loyal to their party in cases where their preferred political candidate was elected as the leader of an opposing party. Once again, this also supports the previous finding that more than 70% of the students who took the survey support voting for political parties instead of individual politicians. The next statement read, even if I disagree with the new platform of my political party, I would continue to support them because voting for an opposing party would be much worse. 52% of the survey participants indicated that they disagreed, while the remaining 48% indicated that they did agree with the statement. And this finding suggests that party polarization and the recent radicalization of the left and right's platforms have prevented undecided adolescent voters from supporting the political parties that they most directly agree with, align with, or support. The next statement read, I primarily support my political party because I believe that their decisions will ultimately benefit the country. And more than 85% of the survey takers indicated that they agreed with the statement, while less than a quarter indicated that they disagreed. Sort of the flip side of this question said, I primarily support my political party because I believe that the decisions of opposing parties will ultimately damage our country. And to this statement, approximately 65% claimed that they agreed, while less than 35% indicated that they disagreed. So the findings from both this question and the previous question suggest that party polarization and the radicalization of party platforms prevent undecided adolescent voters from supporting the parties that they most directly align with. So the next statement said, I believe that remaining loyal to one political party is more important than voting for the politician that most closely aligns with my political values, beliefs, and ideals. And approximately 90% of the survey participants indicated that they strongly disagreed with the statement, while the remaining 10% indicated that they somewhat or mildly agreed with the statement, and no students claimed to strongly agree with the statement. The next read, I would be willing to sacrifice my partisan and policy interests in order to defend the country's democratic principles, which, as you may recall, was one of the two guiding questions behind my study. And to this statement, approximately 70% of participants claimed that they agreed, while only 30% indicated that they disagreed. And the results from this question support the previous finding that adolescents disagree with party loyalty, and the finding also suggests that adolescent voters tend to prize democratic principles over party loyalty in hypothetical situations. So the next statement said, I would be willing to punish the undemocratic behavior of my political party or preferred political candidate by voting for an opposing political party or candidate. And again, this was the second of my two guiding questions. Approximately 56% of the survey respondents indicated that they disagreed with the statement, while the remaining 44% indicated that they did agree with the statement. And this finding suggests that most adolescent voters, despite claiming to value democratic principles over party loyalty, do in fact prize party loyalty over the preservation of democratic principles in real-life scenarios. So on to the last set of statements. The next one reads, I care more about what a candidate promises to do during their campaign than I care about what they actually do upon being elected. And this was the most unanimous result that I received, as more than 95% of students said that they strongly disagreed with the statement, while only 5% agreed that they care more about what candidates promise to do than what they actually do. One of the last few statements says, in cases where my political party or preferred political candidate has been elected, I regularly followed their progress in order to ensure that they were fulfilling their campaign promises and their initial party platform. Approximately 65% of survey takers indicated that they strongly disagreed with the statement, while the remaining 35% indicated that they somewhat agreed with it. As always, this finding suggests that adolescents, despite claiming to care more about what a politician actually does than what they promise to do during their campaign, rarely hold their political parties or preferred political candidates accountable for fulfilling their campaign promises or staying true to their initial party platforms. So the next two statements were designed to obtain information about students' perceptions about the left and right, and specifically to look at the role of the media and media stereotypes in forging students' perceptions about the left and right. So the first was about, obviously, the left, and it read, I agree that the left has been overtaken by socialist, politically correct snowflakes and unemployed woke warriors who want to reap the benefits of social welfare despite not wanting to work. And more than 60% of the respondents claimed that they agreed with the statement, while just under 40% indicated that they disagreed with the statement. Similarly, the next was designed to gather information about adolescent perceptions about the right, and the statement read, I agree that the right has been overtaken by racists, misogynists, and homophobes who want to protect gun rights, heighten federal immigration laws, and abolish social welfare programs. And approximately 66% of the survey takers claimed that they agreed with the statement, while the remaining 34% indicated that they disagreed with it. So the findings from the two previous questions suggest that most undecided adolescent voters have unfortunately fallen victim to political party radicalization, political party polarization, and factually inaccurate political stereotypes. So to wrap up part 2 of my survey, I'm going to do a quick analysis of the notable patterns, observations, and data trends. So number 1, adolescent voters tend to be more concerned about the social beliefs of political parties than they care about the economic beliefs. In addition, political polarization often prevents adolescent voters from supporting the parties that they most directly align with. Similarly, adolescent voters tend to prize the preservation of democratic principles over party loyalty in hypothetical scenarios. However, in real life and in real life situations, adolescents tend to prize party loyalty over the preservation of the country's democratic principles. Likewise, most adolescent voters profess to care more about what a politician actually does. However, in real life. They rarely hold their preferred political candidates accountable for fulfilling their campaign promises or staying true to their initial party platforms. Also, most undecided adolescent voters hold wildly radicalized views and inaccurate perceptions about the left and right, which I'll be exploring more throughout section 3 of my survey. And last but not least, most adolescents have fallen victim to radicalization, polarization, and inaccurate stereotypes. Okay, so on to the third and final section of my survey. The first two set of questions ask students about the impact of their political views on their friendships and familial relationships. So the first question asks students if they've ever felt that one of their relationships or friendships have suffered because of differing or disagreeable political views. And unfortunately, quite a bit of students indicated that they have felt the strain of having differing political beliefs than friends and family members. And as a result, the majority of students that responded to the survey indicated that their political beliefs have negatively impacted their current relationships. Similarly, the second question asked students if they have or would ever cut off a friendship or relationship because of differing political beliefs. And once again, the stark majority of students indicated that they have cut off or would cut off a relationship because of opposing beliefs, and the minority said that they have never been in that position or that they would never consider cutting off a friendship for this reason. So the next question was designed to determine what students believe to be the leading source of political influence in forging adolescents' political views. And so the most voted on answer was media coverage, which 24 students responded. And media coverage includes things like news channels and newspapers and social media sources. The second most voted on answer was family members, with 21 respondents indicating that their family has the most influence over their political beliefs. And very, very, very few students indicated that their teachers or school community influenced their political values, and the fewest amount of students indicated that their friends or peers influenced their political values. It's also interesting to note that 30 students claimed that society's growing pressure to be politically correct has greatly impacted their political values and political beliefs, whereas 20 students indicated that they've never felt pressured to be politically correct. So another trend that was interesting to note is that even students on the left agreed that the right has been more slanderously depicted or portrayed by media sources. However, a fair amount of students also said that they have felt that the left has been more slanderously depicted by the media. So I wanted to test this out myself and also to get a better understanding of the inaccurate perceptions and stereotypes that adolescents hold about different political parties and different political stances on the political spectrum. And so I asked students to write the first 3 words that came to mind without thinking when talking about the right or when talking about the left. And interestingly, there were some common patterns between the two. For example, when asked about what they associate with the right, the most common answers were obviously conservative, economy, traditional, old, religious, white, racist. However, it was also interesting to see the amount of radicalized views that students held. For example, claiming that all people on the right are fascists and that they're racist and misogynistic and homophobic, which obviously is not true for all members of the right. A similar thing happened when students were asked to identify words that came to mind when thinking about the left. The predominant words that came across were liberalism, equality, social justice, love, freedom, progressive, new. However, once again, there were quite a few students who responded with highly, highly radicalized and ultimately inaccurate words like communism, socialism, naive, which once again is not true for every member of the left. So in terms of notable patterns and data trends from part 3 of the survey, Most adolescents indicated that they would cut off a friendship or relationship because of contrasting political values. Media outlets and family members often have the most amount of influence over teenagers' political views and values. Growing pressure to be PC often plays a fundamental role in the shaping and forging of adolescents' political views and beliefs. And last but not least, the majority of adolescents today believe that the right has been more slanderously depicted by the media. So to conclude my presentation, I'm going to be providing a brief conclusion, a brief answer to some of the questions that were outlined in Canvas, and I'll be ending off with a couple of discussion questions. Once again, I am now at 35 minutes. I apologize, so I just don't have time to answer all of them. However, more thoughtful, detailed, written out answers will be submitted in Canvas later today. So the questions that I do quickly want to touch on, number one, were the results what I expected? To be completely honest, no, they were not. You would assume, at least I would assume and did assume, that the majority of students at Appleby identified as left-wing and identified as liberal or NDP. Purely because if you look at the amount of dedication that the school has put into things like DEI training and DEI awareness, it would be safe to assume that the majority of our student body supports the Liberal Party or other left-wing parties. However, this was completely the opposite, and in fact, most students ended up indicating that they support the Conservative Party. So no, the results were not what I expected and contradicted my own assumptions about Appleby and Appleby students. And it also, I should mention, disappointed me to see the amount of students that identified as conservative, not because I have anything against conservatives and not because it's not okay for students to express the party that they align with. But what was disappointing to me was that when I did do the interview component of my study, by the way, I didn't have time to go through the results from the mock election, but I submitted those in a side Word file. But sorry, as I was saying, when I did do the interview piece with the 15 students, the majority of them did identify as conservative. And I specifically asked the students, especially the middle schoolers, can you tell me what about the Conservative Party's platform you agree with? Why do you identify as a Conservative Party member? Why do you identify as a right-wing libertarian? And none of them had any idea what the Conservatives stand for. None of them had any idea what was on their party platform. And so it was disappointing to see that at Appleby, while we're being raised to be students that are leaders and that are critical thinkers, the majority of students at Appleby are followers in a political sense, because about 90, maybe 95% of the students that I had one-on-one interviews with indicated that the reason that they identified as their political party was because of their parents, and said, oh, well, my parents talk to me at dinner about their beliefs and my parents tell me that they're conservative, so that makes me conservative too. And it's disappointing because, as I say, we're raised to be critical thinkers, and at Appleby we're encouraged to challenge our own beliefs and the beliefs of those around us, and yet so many students automatically claim to be so highly educated about politics and were so dead set in the validity of their political party and about the fact that their political party was correct, and yet in reality most of them had absolutely no idea what they or their party stood for. So in conclusion, the results were not what I expected at all, and were pretty disappointing in that sense. Also, could there have been any other explanations for my survey findings or interview results? Absolutely. There were a number of limitations, which again, I've written out in a Word document that I'll attach in Canvas for you to look through, but there could have absolutely been other explanations. For example, if students were doing this not one-on-one, not in a private setting, if students communicated with others, with their peers, if maybe younger, impressionable students did this in a group of people, maybe they all wanted to provide the same answers and wanted to provide answers that they thought I wanted to hear or that they thought I was looking for. And so it is possible that the answers they provided were not 100% honest or 100% accurate. And it's also possible that their responses to the survey were not truly indicative of their true feelings or perceptions about party loyalty. And that was evident throughout the interview when, as I say, so many students contradicted themselves from what they said on their survey in the interview and actually had no idea about any of the things that they wrote about in the survey. So yes, it's absolutely possible that there were other explanations. Last but not least, what are my suggestions for further research on this topic? Well, one of the major limitations of this research assignment for me was that I had to do it with so few students, unfortunately. If time had permitted and if I had more time to speak about my study, I would have loved to have done a similar study with older students, potentially university level students, and then even adults. And it would be so fascinating for me to do this survey and this study again with the same group of students a couple years down the road when they're in university, when they're removed from their family environments, when they're being more independent, when they're paying their own taxes, they're living on their own, to see how, once they're removed from their current environments, how their political perceptions change and how their political beliefs and political values change over time. So that would be probably my biggest suggestion for further research, would be to try this out with a much bigger group of students, and also to try this out with students in different age groups and to see how environment plays a role in our understanding of the Canadian political landscape. All right, thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I apologize again for making this so long, but thank you for taking the time out of your day or night to watch this. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to read the extra Word documents that I promise I will submit. And thank you for a great year. It's been a really fun course. All right, bye.